Okay, we've got a good group of people here today. Faces I'm sure you recognize. We've got Andrew Wilkinson, who's the leader of the official opposition party, of course, the Liberal Party. With us today is also Linda Reid, MLA for Richmond South Centre, John Yap from Richmond Steveston, Teresa Watt from Richmond North Centre, and Jazz Johal from Richmond Queensborough. Okay, Andrew, we're going to start with you, and then we'll open it up to everybody else here. Watching the debate the other night, and I've talked to my friends, and we don't often always agree politically, but one thing we all agreed upon was that you're both very passionate about your sides, you and the Premier, but that we got lost in the discussion and people talking over everybody. Today, we're just going to keep it very polite. We're having coffee, talking. Let's start by talking about your feelings on this upcoming vote.
Well, thanks for having us all, and great to be here. I think the concern we have is that this referendum is about voting rights. It's about something very fundamental in our democracy. Those voting rights belong to the voters. They don't belong to political parties. And what we've seen, unfortunately, in this referendum is that John Horgan and the NDP have basically taken it upon themselves to control the process. Part of that is we have a very confusing ballot that's come out to people. They get this thing in the mail, they're probably paying a bit of attention, they know it's coming. Once they get it, they read through it, and they're more confused than ever. And so what we tried to do in the debate was answer some very basic questions, such as how many MLAs would you have under this new system? How big would the ridings be under the new system? And it's something as simple as how many votes will you have? 2, 3, 4, 5 votes? That's pretty basic for people to make up their minds. And unfortunately, Premier Horgan wouldn't answer any of those questions.
That was a point in the discussion the other night that you had where you pressed a couple of times and didn't get the answer, at least that I wanted to hear. Let's get to some of the questions. As you said, we've kind of taken a poll of people on the street. Everybody is very engaged, but I think the commonality is this confusion on this. So these are some of the questions we want to know. And Andrew, I'll stick with you for a few minutes here. There are 3 options on the referendum ballot. Is it true that 2 of the 3 options on the ballot have never been used before?
That's correct. One of them, called MMP, is used in 4 countries around the world, including the poorest country in South America and a tiny country in Africa. And the other 2 options have never been used anywhere in the world. And so you have to ask, why is that? Because there are more than a dozen different options that are available around the world, and the NDP suddenly chose these 3, and it makes you wonder why they chose them, which adds to people's sense of uncertainty about this thing. You can't blame people for being unsure about this ballot because it's quite confusing. And so we're suggesting to people, if they want to have this done properly, to have citizens engaged in developing a question about changing the electoral system, they can safely choose to vote for line 1, which is to keep the current system, and then they'll get a proper citizens' assembly in a few years where a simple yes-no question would come up, and that would go on the ballot at the next general election.
Can you talk a little bit more? You alluded to the process of putting the 3 options together. Can you talk a bit about how that did come together?
Well, this is another unfortunate point in that the NDP said that when they cut their deal with the Green Party to form government in the summer of 2017, one of the conditions from the Green Party was to hold a referendum. And that's unfortunate because this is really being driven by the needs of political parties, not by the needs of voters and citizens. We had 2 referendums before, in 2005 and 2009. Both times the citizens of BC at a general election voted not to change the system. And now, because of the need to keep the Green Party happy, the NDP have put this referendum forward. So that's where we find ourselves. It's been set up with very minimal public involvement. The NDP chose the options, the NDP wrote the ballot, and we're asked to make our decision on that basis.
Okay, another question we received is it true that 60% of the MLAs will be voted in and 40% will be appointed from a candidate list privately set by the party in power?
Well, this is actually a small part of a bigger question, because if you look at all these options on the ballot, which we have here in front of us, there are 23 or more different features of these systems that haven't been disclosed. The NDP know what the answers are that they want, and they can get it afterwards, but they won't tell you what those options are. So we've been saying to people, this is a bit like going to the car dealership and saying, I want to buy a car, and the dealer, John Horgan, says, well, I'm not going to tell you whether it's diesel, gas, electric, won't tell you how many doors it's got, won't even tell you the color. Just sign here and you'll get a car, and he's going to choose the car. So this is a problem because there are many, many features that are just simply unknown about this, and we're suggesting people make the straightforward choice of sticking with the current system. On line 1 of the ballot, it says, do you want to keep the current system known as first past the post? We suggest that people fill that out, and only that line, then they can move ahead with some assurance that this is going to be an orderly process, not something that's been set up for to keep the Green Party happy.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one last question, then we'll open up to the rest of your colleagues here. One of the questions people asked me a lot was, will proportional representation system cost the government more money?
Well, this referendum is costing about $15 million, and that's a very good reason why it should have been done at the same time as a general election, where it would have been free. It also would have been much cleaner at a general election because there's no need to mail stuff out to people. They would have all gone to vote at the ballot box anyway. And then there's this question of, if you do change to a proportional representation system, you get lots of little parties that proliferate. That's how it works everywhere in the world where it's been used, and they each have their own spending expectations. So you can bet your bottom dollar that your taxes are going to go up and government spending will go up, because the idea is to keep those small parties happy, to keep them in a coalition. Okay.
Well, we should remind people, and we will continue to do this throughout the day. If you're watching and want more information, it's elections.bc.ca. You can also call 1-800-661-8683, 1-800-661-8683, elections.bc.ca. Okay, as we mentioned earlier, along with Andrew today is Linda, John, Teresa, and Jazz. Guys, I'd like to open up and get your thoughts. We'll work our way around the table. It's the easiest way to do this. Linda, let's start with you.
Well, when my constituents come to talk to me.
Oh, I think, you know what, hang on, we're doing live stream. You gotta have a microphone. This is not mine. Linda, my apologies.
Come to talk to me, we basically have a conversation about there's two types of voting. There's the one where you mark the ballot, you get to choose the name you're going to put your mark by, or there's types of ballot of voting where the party marks the ballot. Mm-hmm. And I've spent my career, all my life, worried about how we get more women involved in politics. The notion that we're going to take what has now become a front room exercise where women seek the nomination in a transparent, open way, mm-hmm. and put that in the back room and decide whether or not a woman's name gets chosen off a list, any candidate's name gets chosen off a list. It's hugely problematic for me. I see that as a step backwards. Mm-hmm. And if you take the four of us here, who's running for election, who gets appointed to election, at the end of the day, how accountable will anyone be to the voter if that person doesn't have any kind of trust relationship? There's been no discussion at all about whether or not this person selected or appointed into a particular riding will actually reside in that riding, will actually come from the area. Mm-hmm. That's hugely important to me. Local representation is hugely important to me.
Yeah, because I think that one of the questions, I remember one of the questions was about, okay, if I know that you're my MLA or I don't know who my MLA is in the region, if people are getting appointed, I don't know, who do I go see? Do I come see you? Do I go see, so are you finding people are asking that a lot?
Yeah. And we don't know the answers either, and the leader is absolutely correct that the New Democrats haven't said a single word about what happens the day after. Should this pass, and I think it's hugely problematic in terms of local representation, direct access from your MLA, and direct accountability to your MLA. Mm-hmm. I think those things need to be the foundation stones for how we go forward.
Excellent. Jazz, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, my experience, and I look back to my experience as a journalist, having covered many communities throughout BC, but globally as well. And for me, the number one word that's very important for me is stability. Mm-hmm. We have built one of the greatest economies in the world. We have one of the best healthcare systems in the world, best education, advanced education, primary education, and a standard of living. That doesn't happen by accident for a province that has a very diverse geography and diverse people. And we've done that with first past the post. So if you look at British Columbia on its own and compare that to jurisdictions around the world, 195 countries globally, what are we lacking? At the end of the day, yes, we can make education a little bit better, healthcare could be improved, and that's something that we continue to work on. But the basic electoral system that allows accountability, that has allowed us to build this great province and continues to grow. Mm-hmm. So who are we doing this for? The problem I find with proportional representation is you get very much small extreme parties. It could be along linguistic lines, racial lines, religious lines, whatever it may be, that those parties benefit when they remain strident. Mm-hmm. The present system forces us to be to have basically broad parties. Within our caucus, we will have disagreements, but we will come to agreement, coalesce around broad ideas, because we're a broad province, but we're a large province of a diverse population. So the present system forces diverse parties to have big tent parties, to listen to different views within your caucus. And then we've been able to build this great society because of it. Mm-hmm. You bring in proportional representation, you're going to get extremist parties who benefit by sticking to a very narrow view of the world and not saying, I'm going to compromise here because for the greater good. And so that's the challenge that I find that we're going to be under. Don't worry about whether this is a three-party system right now. under proportional representation, I can guarantee you we'll have 4, 5, 6, 7 parties coming forward. So how are you ever going to get things done? Right? Government costs more too under.
I was going to say, one of the things I did hear, and I've been reading a lot about too, is that countries doing this, it seems to take a lot more time to put the government in place.
Yeah, in some cases, it's 500 days we've seen in some European countries. So that's a challenge as well. I just think the system in this province works. In this case, we're bringing this forward. Why? Because the Green Party has demanded it from the NDP. This is to placate a 3-person party. It's not because the NDP is demanding it. It's to placate the leader of the Green Party. And this is going to go on and on and on. And as Andrew has said, it's costing us $15 million to placate a 3-person party. That $15 million can pay for probably almost 5 or 6 hours of health care in this province. Yeah, right? And that's what we're talking about here.
Okay. John, we're going to hand things over to you. John Yap, your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Jim, and it's great to be here. Thanks to the Sentinel for this opportunity. Probably the number one issue that I hear from constituents who come in and talk to us about this is the potential, if we go to Prop Rep, to losing the local connection, the local accountability. That's the number one issue for constituents, that they want to feel that their MLA that is representing them is someone that is from the community or is part of the community, and when time for the election is someone that they have a chance to vote for or not vote for. So that's probably the number one concern that constituents have. And Linda and Jazz have covered some of the really critical points. The one I think we've all heard about, which I think is worth emphasizing, is this is such a rushed and poorly put together process, which really should not have been in the hands of politicians, on either side. It should have been done in a nonpartisan way, as was done in 2005 and 2009, where it was handled through a citizens' assembly that put together ordinary citizens with no political axe to grind to brainstorm about how do we potentially reform our electoral system. And they did that, and they came up with a suggestion. We had 2 referendum, and both did not succeed. Now, here's one of the things that's not in place now, which was the case back in 2005 and 2009. We had some reasonable thresholds. So the current referendum has no participation threshold. So right now we're seeing about 5% of British Columbians return their ballots. Yeah. And there's no minimum requirement. So if we end up on November 30th that only, say, 10 or 12% or 15% of British Columbians mail in their ballots, this thing could be decided by a very small percentage, which only requires 50% plus 1 to pass.
And it's should we clarify too? It's 50% plus 1 of the ballots
mailed in.
Yes. So you even minimize more.
Sure. Okay. I mean, there's almost 4.9 million British Columbians. There's about 3.5 million voters in that range. And if it happens that at the end of November, Elections BC only receives 10% of the ballots back, and 50% plus 1 of the ballots returned decide for PR, that could be the consequence of this process that's being put in place. There was no minimum threshold for participation. There was no minimum for at least showing a reasonable majority of British Columbians. In past referendum, it was 60%. Right. You needed 60% threshold to pass. You also needed 60% of the ridings around the province. So that ensured some fairness about representation, so that this thing couldn't be decided by a few ridings within the Lower Mainland turning in their ballots. So we've said from day one, and we'll continue to say, that this process has been botched, and that the only approach is to say, keep our current system, and as Andrew has said, if we're ever going to have a opportunity to look at reforming our system, it should be done in a nonpartisan way with a citizen assembly and keep politics out of it. And unfortunately, that's not the case now.
Okay. Teresa, we'll go to you last here.
Thank you, Jim. First of all, I'd like to thank the Sentinel for giving us this opportunity to talk about the pros and cons of a proportional representation. I think this is exactly the kind of opportunity this NDP government should have given to British Columbia so that we can have more debate, more information session, but instead it's such a rushed process that we don't really have much time to really communicate to British Columbians about the free proportional representation option, because right now the government hasn't really given any information. As our leader already said, there are 23 factors that are not known. You don't know how many MLAs there will be under proportional representation, and you don't know how many MLA that will represent your riding. For example, in our Richmond municipality, right now we have 4 ridings that if any of the PR is implemented, we might incorporate into 1 riding. Even worse still.
I was going to ask, would it be, I assume it would be 2. If that way, would it, you don't
Nobody
know.
knows. Nobody knows. They refuse to answer our question. And I think one other point we should note is all the current and the late NDP premiers, they all say no to British Columbia, including Glenn Clark. Glenn Clark said that under any of the PR, there will be no local representation. There will be no local accountability. And Wujo Dosanjh said that there will be giving rise to extremist party, and he's really worried because he is the victim of the extremists. And the late Dave Barrett said no to proportional representation. I remember Mike Harcourt also said no in 2009 during our referendum. So you will ask, why are all the NDP premiers saying no except John Horgan? So obviously, this is a secret deal, not a secret deal, it's an open deal between NDP and the Green Party because they want to hold on to power. And John Horgan has to give in to Andrew Weaver, or else he will topple him and it will trigger another election. So this is their ambition to hold on to power, and this is not fair to British Columbia because we are not being given clear information. Let's talk about my own riding. I represent Richmond North Centre. And over 50% of my constituents are immigrants from Asia. And they have been talking to me that they received this ballot package. And it's so confusing. And in the last 2 times, in 2005, 2009, we just give them a simple yes and no answer. And now you are given 2 parts of the question. They can't even know what the 3 options are. I don't think it's fair. And they all come to ask me, how am I going to fill up this ballot? This is not unfair because we have not been even given any kind of information session. Just ask them to go to Election BC website. That's not clear, even on Election BC website, because the government hasn't given information to Election BC to state clearly what the 3 options are. So I think it's definitely not fair. We are not saying that first past the vote is the perfect system. As Winston Churchill said, is the best one given that there are no better option. But if we want to change the system, we got to give British Columbia more information so that they can make an informed decision.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, I want to come back to you on this. Your colleagues have alluded to this a couple of times in terms of previous referendums. A lot of people don't have long memories when it comes to what's been going on in the last 15 years. That's fine. People got busy lives. But can you just explain to our viewers what was the pitch then in 05 and 09, I believe, and what went wrong and what were the pitfalls? Give people a background on the previous
there were 2 unusual elections in 1996 and 2001. The first one, 1996, the Liberal Party had many thousands more votes than the NDP, but the NDP won more seats. And then in 2001, people might remember that there was a huge wave of support for the BC Liberals.
Andrew, sorry
and
to cut you off. Won't cut you off again.
The Liberals won 77 seats to 2. And so with those 2 unusual elections, people thought, well, maybe it's time to have another look at our voting system. So in 2004, Gordon Campbell put together this Citizens Assembly, which was done by selecting people at random from all around British Columbia. And it's very important to remember, in that process, the political parties themselves were told to stay completely out of it. They were 1,000 kilometers away from this process. And what happened over a period of a year, that group of citizens with the right academic support, with the right funding, came up with a simple yes-no question. And it was, do you favor changing to what was called STV, a particular voting system? That was put on the general election ballot in 2005, and it was defeated. It was put on the ballot again in 2009, and it was thoroughly defeated by about 61 to 39% of the population. So people thought, well, we've had enough of that now, and no need to revisit that for the near future. And then along came this deal between the Green Party and the NDP last summer, and the Green Party initially said they wanted it just to be a vote in the legislature to force us all to accept their new voting system. And the answer to that was forget it. So what we've got instead is this mail-in ballot that we've all seen in the mail that is very confusing, and we think it's a totally inappropriate way to go about it. It really should have been kept in the hands of citizens, because you, the citizens of British Columbia, are the ones who should own and operate the voting system. It shouldn't be toyed with and monkeyed with by political parties. That's exactly what's going on right now.
Andrew, one of the questions that someone posed to me is they said, look, I don't want to sound simple, but I really thought that the ballot would be just yes or no, just check. And they get it, and Teresa, I believe you alluded to the fact that you look and oh, there's a whole bunch of other things. Can you walk everybody through the next question, which was explain all the options that are on that?
Exactly.
First, the one we've been doing now, and three ones being proposed.
Well, there's a very short answer to this and a very long answer. We got the ballot here in front of us, and the first question says, do you favor keeping the current system known as first past the post? And you can fill in the circle there. In fact, that's what we suggest you do, and then you're done. Because that's sending a clear message to the NDP and the Greens that don't play games with this voting system, because this is a very confusing ballot. If you fill it in that way, we keep our current system for the near future, and we've suggested there should be another look at whether we change this, but done in a way that's not being toyed with by political parties. It's done entirely by the citizens of BC. So that's the way in which you guarantee yourselves an orderly future, a way in which our electoral system will be protected, and you can decide whether to change it, not the political parties. Unfortunately, the rest of the ballot says, do you favor changing to proportional representation? If you fill in that, then you're supposed to fill in the little table underneath, which is like a crossword puzzle, and you have to choose between three options. And they are DMP, RUP, and MMP, and I have yet to find anybody in the province of British Columbia who can explain the whole thing to me. Those involve voting multiple times, and they won't tell us how many times, as many as 5 or 6 times on a ballot, and then your votes are transferred around the province. And this is a key question that I asked John Horgan in the debate last Thursday, and he refused to answer it. How are those votes moved around BC? Are all of my votes moved around, or just the second or third or fourth or fifth vote? It's very confusing, and they're not providing any answers. So we suggest to people, you can vote to keep the current system by simply filling out the first line of the referendum ballot, and then you're done. You can package it up, sign it the way you're supposed to, and send it in, and you'll be done.
Can we just off the road here for a second in terms of voting in general? One of the things I've seen, and we saw it in the States this past week with their midterms, is getting younger people to vote. I mean, I think it was all-time high in the American midterms, but it was still horrible. How are we going to reach the younger folks? Because we're talking more about, I'm on the further tail end than I am at the beginning, so we're talking about the millennials' futures. That is the market I think that needs to be targeted. And I'll open this up to everybody. How do we hit them? Is there something we could do better? Can we have online help? How do we get them interested? Because I said to you, I can see a 21, 22-year-old, if he does get the ballot, probably chucking or not interested. How do we engage them? We'll start with you.
This is very important, because obviously the incoming young voters beyond the age of 18 are the future of the province. And it's interesting, in the U.S., a lot of people don't want to vote because if they get on the voters list in the U.S., they're subject to jury duty and they get called off their job and dragged in for lengthy trials.
Okay.
In Canada, that's not the case. So we encourage people to make sure they're registered to vote. If they didn't receive the ballot and they're Canadian citizens over 18, they should be in contact with Elections BC and make sure they get a ballot. And they can still do that. Now, in terms of youth involvement, our job as elected people is to make politics and the world we live in exciting for young people, to talk about those opportunities for all of BC so that young people get the sense that it matters. Right now, it may seem to them, well, it's not going to make any difference, they're not really following it, and they'll just leave it aside. We really encourage young people to get involved and to make informed decisions.
And are we putting a platform? I mean, like, I think doing something like today, and Jazz, you've been TV a long time, I've been doing TV a long time, the numbers are going down in terms of TV. Are you reaching out to other platforms, obviously this being one of them? So, I mean, where are the kids looking to get more information? Instagram, Twitter? Yeah,
Totally.
social media.
And,
yeah.
you know, the change away from the old world of newspapers, which is almost done, into the world of electronic communication. In the 50s, it was television. And nowadays, it's social media. And so the unfortunate thing about social media that we all know is you get into a channel on social media and all you hear is your own views repeated. You don't get a broader view of the world. And so it's important for all of us to hold events like this, to offer ourselves up to the voters, no matter what age they are, so they can make their own decision, provide as much information as we can, and let voters make their minds up. And that should have been the way for how this whole thing was set up. But unfortunately, it got taken over by the NDP. And we're now trying to send a clear message that these are voters' rights. These don't belong to a political party. We should respect the voters, stick with the current system, and then people will have their options fully available to them.
Just sticking with that point, and somebody else can answer, or Andrew, you answer. How do you deal with like kind of that low voter turnout?
Well, why don't we hand this over to the TV man, Mr. Jas Johal. Here you go.
Well, I think that's a very complex question. If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be doing other things, because it's an issue that plagues not only Canada but the United States and Western Europe as well. It's an ongoing issue. But, you know, we cannot forget the fact that about 38% of the Lower Mainland now is millennial. So those are people 36, 37 and under. That is a challenge. You saw in the last federal election a greater amount of millennials voting. You saw a greater amount of millennials and young people voting in the midterm elections. I think the highest numbers in almost 2 or 3 decades. So you're seeing pockets of real optimism there, and I think it's a question of the policies that all political parties bring forward in regards to really addressing some of these needs. In 9 out of 10 provinces today, Gen X and millennials, collectively those 52 and under, outnumber baby boomers. Baby boomers still play a significant role in this province and have a lot to offer. But policies, to a certain degree, have been tad baby boomer-centric probably the last 2 decades, because they have been the wider swath of the population. So there is a generational shift going on, not just in politics, but in the corporate world and in all jobs and professions out there. So it's our job now to recognize that. I think that conversation is now starting to permeate the conversation in politics in regards to how do we address those issues, like look at affordability, what are the jobs of the present and the future, particularly with technical disruption that's out there. So I think these are coming to the forefront anyway. And I think also, and I found this in television, is that once you get married, you have children, you have a mortgage, you have those daily needs and requirements of a job, commuting to work, all those issues that you've got to deal with. And when you start going through that, when you just sort of go through life, you get engaged into transportation issues, you get engaged into economic issues, you get engaged into daily politics. So that's part of that as well. And I think I look back to when I was in my early 20s to today, you're much more engaged now in the political process and in what's going on in life. But I think in this case, with the low voter turnout, as Andrew said, or John has said, at 5%, this isn't a millennial issue. It's also a Gen X issue, and it's a baby boomer issue. Yes. We're not engaging British Columbians. And I think part of the problem is that the process that the Premier and the Green Party set up. It's specifically set up to be manipulative. It's specifically set up to confuse people. It shouldn't be this difficult at the end of the day to decide what political system you support, 1, and 2, at the end of it, even if you did support Prop Rap, there are 29 outstanding issues that will be decided after you voted by the NDP cabinet. It's ridiculous. So to argue that this is just we're not reaching out to millennials, I don't think so at all. I think this is a failure to excite and, at the end of the day, engage British Columbians. And that falls at the feet of Mr. Horgan and, to a certain degree, Mr. Weaver and the Green Party.
I think that was what we started out with, is all about these simplistic answers to just basic questions is what we want to get out. Again, you're both very passionate, sir, and I watched the whole debate the other night, but you both want to get your points out, and just that people we're talking to on the streets have that comment about, I'm confused. Even if you do your research, well, if you vote this, you get extremists coming up the ranks. If you do. If you don't, you get extremists coming. It's very difficult to kind of work your way through the research on both sides that are reinforcing.
Yeah, and I understand where you're coming from there, but at the end of the day, with our present system, if you're not happy with what Jas Johal is doing, or any of these MLAs have done, they're accountable to you. You can go knock on their doors and say, look, I got an issue. Can you please deal with it? I don't care if you're a BC Liberal, a New Democrat in my riding, or a Green. I'm there to help you, number one. Number two, if I don't perform, then I'm accountable every 4 years, or you can vote me out. People understand that system. And like I said, it's worked for us for over 150 years. It's worked for over 300 years in the UK. So why are we messing with it? If there are tweaks that need to be made within the system, let's do it. And let's be honest, the BC Liberals, as Andrew has said and John has said, we introduced this a vote in 2005 and 2009. And the fundamental difference is, A, it had accountability and authenticity there. Why? Because we handed it over to the public. You decide what the question is. I remember as a journalist covering those conversations at the WAS Centre for Dialogue. It was everyday people from every riding getting together in Vancouver saying, what's wrong with the system? How do we want to fix it? Here's the question. And it's a simple yes and no question, number one. Number two, here's what's going to happen if this thing moves ahead, which means here's some maps. This is what your riding's going to look like after if you vote yes. So there is, at its core, honesty there. You don't have any of that there in this case. You have Mr. Horrigan saying, look, if you vote for this, first of all, I'm not sure how to explain the system because it's too complicated for me. Hey, what do I know? I'm just the premier. So Andrew got right to the point with him. The premier of this province couldn't explain what we're expected to vote on, number one. And even if you do vote for Prop Rep, there's 29 outstanding issues, and don't worry, the NDP cabinet will handle that as well. So if you don't start with honesty and authenticity right from the start, what's the point? So that's what offends me as a voter.
Linda, you want to jump in?
I just want to come back to your point on millennial voters. I'm the mother this year of a millennial voter.
Okay, tell us.
And in probably about 6 to 8 months back, she got all her friends together and signed them all up because they were voting the first time ever in the municipal election. Hugely important, and the notion that they're all signed up now has frankly sparked their interest, so they continue to have dialogue conversation. She's now in first year at the University of Victoria, and she has a whole array of probably 100 guys all the time saying, what about this, what about that? So is there interest? Absolutely. Can they get the information they're looking for? In this instance, not. So they're frustrated. They're absolutely frustrated.
Does that turn to apathy then? We're just, I can't
Well, we can't let it slip away. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about John Horgan badly wrapping up a birthday gift for Andrew Weaver. And frankly, all of us collectively as British Columbians are paying for it. The notion that it's completely misunderstood in so many ways. And it's not a question of whether or not you want to see electoral reform. It's whether or not you want to see electoral reform done properly. I mean, even the fact that there's no threshold. I mean, you can't change a bylaw in a townhouse complex with less than 75% of the vote. And this has no threshold? I mean, the young people, my daughter and her friends, they are absolutely appalled that it's just a free-for-all. It's an absolute free-for-all. And they see stacks of them stacked up at the university, abandoned ballots. There's no security in terms of showing up at the ballot and having identification that describes yourself. There's just pick up 20 extra ballots and do what with it? I mean, all of it is just clumsy and awkward, not done particularly well. Kids have an exact sense of ethics and understanding and want it to be done well if it's going to be done at all. That's where they are today.
They seem to be the most, and they're probably watching because we're doing it on this forum, but they seem the most moralistic in terms of what they expect from something as simple as their brands. You know, a Nike ad being the most recent one where they do. It's just getting them to get engaged. And sorry, Tracy, you wanted to say?
Actually, it's an excellent question that you asked, Jim. That's why BC Liberal, well, our caucus and the whole party have been trying hard to reach out to all, especially millennials. And that's why in our recent convention, Andrew announced the new brand for BC Liberal. Our slogan is opportunity for all of BC. Andrew wants to really provide opportunity to the millennials so that when every young person that come home, they say, Mom, Dad, I got a job. That's what we are about, and that's how we are going to appeal to millennials. That's what I want to put across.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, would you explain, I believe in the debate you mentioned that you're not against change, if it's done correctly, you said, but you talk a bit about citizens' assembly.
Sure. This was something that was done back in 2004, and the idea was to get people randomly chosen from around BC, and if you were chosen and couldn't do it, they would transfer that to someone else. But these were true average British Columbians who came in from all over the province, and then they got their say in what they were concerned about, and were asked to come up with a very straightforward yes-no question, and that's what happened in the 2005 election that was put on the ballot. So the beauty of that is it cost nothing to do the voting at the ballot because it was at the same time as a general election, and it was also maximum public interest, and importantly, it meant that there was no possibility of fraud because it's an election. You have to show your face to the people who work for Elections BC. So that was the right way to do it. And the concern we have now is this is the wrong way to do it, with incomplete information, a confusing ballot being mailed in to keep the Green Party happy. This is not the right way in which to go to the fundamentals of your democracy. And there's a real key concern we have that John Yap is probably going to elaborate on, that this effectively, what they're proposing, transfers power from the voter to the hands of the political parties. Because you're asked to pick a party, and then the party bosses choose the MLAs, who don't have to come from anywhere near you. They could come from Kamloops or Campbell River and purport to represent Richmond. And it's going to encourage a lot of nepotism and insider behavior where people choose their friends to be MLAs. John?
I have been following social media quite closely, especially in this issue, and in recent days, that it's really ramped up on all sides. And one of the tweets that struck me yesterday was one that referred to if you go to Prop Rep, you're actually and allowing parties to pick MLAs. Those MLAs could be picked over and over and over again, and it's almost a form of tenure, for politicians. And I think, sure, in the academic system, the university system, we all accept that, yes, there is a place for the tenure system, but I don't think British Columbians would stand for moving to a system where political parties, through mechanisms that may not be transparent, that may be potentially corrupt, would entrench the selection of individuals that people really don't want to be their MLAs, but simply because they're members in good standing with a political party, so-called party hacks, insiders, loyalists, they get rewarded with positions. And they could be appointed to be in ridings anywhere in the province. And I think British Columbians, when they hear that, will reject that, because we are all and I hear this from constituents, we value this tradition that has been handed down to us over the last 100+ years of living in this democracy, which is you have a vote and you vote for the person that stands for election, and the candidate that has the most votes wins in that riding. And that's a direct connection, and I believe that's what people value. They cherish that, and they want to see that continue.
Well said. Okay, what we're going to do, and leading from that, we're going to wrap up soon. One of the things that we've been stressing today, and one of the impressions I got the last couple of days, or as the people working on the crew, is just give me the basics. And so, Andrew, we'll start with you. 30 seconds. Tell that person on the street why they should say no.
Well, the concern about this referendum is that it's taking your rights as a voter and playing games with it. And there's a very clear way for you to say, I'm not interested in getting into all these specific details. I haven't been told the whole story. I'm confused by the whole process. You can send that message clearly on this referendum by simply filling in the first line on the ballot saying you want to keep the current system. And if we have anything to say with it, you'll get that citizens' assembly where you'll have a clear opportunity to express yourselves later on. The concern with this system is it's come around. Most people are pretty confused when they get the ballot. They feel like they're being imposed upon. They're not sure what to do with it. And that leads to low participation. Right now, we have less than 5% of people who voted. That's no way to change the electoral system. It's certainly no way to elect the government of a province to have 5% of people making a choice.
Okay, great. Tracy?
John Horgan asked the British Columbians to vote for proportional representation by leap of faith. As Warren Palmer said, this is a leap into darkness. So I'm hoping that British Columbia know that this is not a fair referendum. How can you have a leap into darkness, as Warren Palmer said? So vote yes to maintain the current first past the post system and say no to proportional representation. Thank you.
So that darkness and that leap into the unknown is the lack of information, key details that the government, the NDP and the Greens are not providing us. They may know those details, but they're not providing us. So we are asking British Columbians, asking voters to vote to keep the current system, first past the post, and as been said, you only need to answer question 1, keep first past the post, and send in your ballot in the envelopes as needed. It's important to vote, and we encourage people to do that. This right to vote is every British Columbian's right, and we encourage all British Columbians, all voters, to participate, to support first past the post, which has worked well for our province for over 100 years. And let's not muck it up by leaping into the unknown.
Okay, Jazz?
Yeah, I'm going to keep my comments very short. I think my colleagues have really nailed it on the head here. This has been rigged from day one. And what I am telling voters is what I've said at the beginning of this program, to look at British Columbia and the stability that we have. A great province, an affluent province, a just province with a great healthcare system and education system, great standard of living, which still is a beacon of light to people around the world. From all over the world, people want to move to British Columbia for a reason. We do things well here, and that's because of the first-past-the-post system. We've been able to provide for our citizens in the past century, and we are building a 21st century economy that I think is going to provide just as much in regards to resources and in regards to benefits. That happens because of what we've done with first-past-the-post. So I ask that my constituents and all Richmondites to please support the present system of first-past-the-post. Number one, put it in with black ink and one and done. Mail it off, and I think that's the way to go.
Okay, and lastly, Linda.
I want to continue to live in a province and, frankly, in a country where I get to mark my ballot, where I get to put my mark against the name of the person I believe will best represent me. That's the crux of the issue for me. I don't want a political party, any political party, making that determination for me. I think it's about individual rights and freedoms, and I want to continue to exercise mine.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of the Richmond Sentinel, we want to thank you all for joining us here today. I hope that the viewers watching out there were able to get some education. We're talking to all the parties today. Liberal Party was first. We've been talking with Andrew Wilkinson, the Party leader. We also had Linda Reid, John Yap, Tracy Watt, Jazz Johal, all Liberal candidates here with Andrew. And we're going to take a break. We're going to talk to Martin in just a few seconds. Again, thank you all for taking time today. It's a busy day, and we appreciate you being here in Richmond to talk to us. And we wish you luck going forward.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.